to the channel. Thank you for joining me today to talk to you about what I call the engagement trap. In our last video, I talked to you about why your classroom rule systems were failing. With that, I provided the root causes as to why they fail and also provided strategies with 5 steps on how to build a system that actually works through the just balance framework that has 3 pillars. If you have not watched that video, I highly encourage you to go back and look at video number 1 that's titled Why Your Classroom Rules Fail. That will give you a pretty good idea as to how to build a system that actually works. Today we are going to be covering another topic. It's what I call the engagement trap. Here's what it is. Most of us have these days where you walk into your classroom and the lesson was just going great. The students were working in groups. The room was buzzing. And then you were walking around, clipboard in hand, feeling like, yes, this is it. This is what teaching is supposed to look like. Getting excited that something is happening. I am finally able to reach my students and engage my students. Then you look at one group's work and you've been watching them for 15 minutes having conversations. But then you see that they have absolutely almost nothing on the paper, on the page. Or maybe you gave a quiz the next day and the results were dismal. And you stood there thinking, what happened? But they were so engaged. I saw it. The room was buzzing, was alive. See, yes, the students were very much busy. But let me tell you what happened. They were busy. However, busy is not the same thing as learning. They're 2 different things. And busyness, unfortunately, has been the most seductive trap in teaching. Because it looks like engagement. It feels like success. And it is eating the learning time of students in classrooms all over the world, quietly, invisibly, every single day. And today we are going to break it open. I'm going to show you exactly what real engagement is, why the trap is so hard to escape for most of us, and give you the just balance between meaningful engagement, meaningful activity, and actual learning. I am Henry, and this is Palaver, where we find the just balance in education. Let me get right into it. Before I do, I would like to actually offer a definition of what the trap is. What do I mean by engagement trap? Because engagement has become one of the most overused yet under-examined words in education. Ask most schools or teachers this question. What does an engaged student look like? And here's what you will get as an answer. They will say something like this. Oh, when a student is on task, when the student is following directions, when the student is participating, or when the student is not causing problems. This is how they define it. Yes, this is a management definition. We've been using it as a learning definition. That's where the trap begins, unfortunately. And I would like to share with you that there are 3 phases of what I call false engagement. And I want you to recognize them by going over each one of them so that you can recognize them, because they probably are showing up in your classroom. If not right now, maybe yesterday, maybe tomorrow. So let's go with phase number 1 first. It's what I call engagement activity. This is what I call activity engagement, not engagement activity. It's activity engagement. This is when students are doing something, such as they're cutting, pasting, coloring, moving around, filling in the blanks. It does look productive when you look at it because it keeps everyone occupied and it produces almost no durable learning. unfortunately. The worksheet that keeps 30 students quiet for 20 minutes is not a lesson. Instead, it's what I call crowd control with a font. So that's phase number one, the activity engagement. When students are occupied, they're busy, they're doing something, looking productive, yet learning nothing that is durable. Phase number two, this is what I call compliance engagement. So this is a case where students are following directions. They appear attentive to whatever tasks they're on. But if you look more closely, the student who looks like they are taking notes is basically copying words without processing them. The hand raiser who gives the right answer can't explain where that answer came from. Compliance is not comprehension. And a classroom full of compliant students is not necessarily a classroom full of learning students. That is the phase number two. If we move to phase number three, it is what I call performance engagement. And this one is the sneakiest one of all, because it actually looks and feels like real engagement. Students have high energy. There's high participation in the classroom. Everyone is excited. The Kahoot scores are flying. The debate is passionate. The gallery walk has beautiful posters all over. But if the thinking demand underneath all of that energy is low, well, the learning is going to be low. That's just the gist of it. Now, I want to be clear. None of these are evil, by the way. Students need to do things. They need to comply sometimes. They need to have fun. The problem is when we mistake any of these for the destination of our learning, of our student learning. Busy kids are manageable, absolutely. But thinking kids are learning, not just managed, but they're learning. And those are not always in the same room. So, after saying all of that, you might be wondering, what does real engagement actually look like? So, if those three are traps, are the trap, I should say, what is the real thing? Well, educational research actually gives us a very useful framework here. There are 3 tiers of engagement, and most classroom strategies are only targeting the first 2. Right? Let's look at tier number 1. Tier 1 is what we call behavioral engagement. Right? Behavioral engagement, like, are students showing up? Are they participating? Are they making efforts? This is what most walkthroughs measure. The folks who come to your classroom to observe and notate and evaluate, these are things that they're looking for, right? That's what they measure. Tier number 2 is called emotional engagement. So here's where the questions are like, do students feel a sense of belonging? Do they show any interest? Are they enthusiastic? This is what most relationship building strategies target. Going to tier number 3, this is what we call cognitive engagement. And this is where questions like, are students actively processing information? Are students actively constructing meaning? Are students actively grappling with ideas? Answer. Now, behavioral engagement keeps students in the room. Emotional engagement, on the other hand, keeps them willing. But cognitive engagement, here's what it does. It is where learning actually happens. It is the tier we most consistently underinvest in. So those are the three tiers that research actually has said are tiers of engagement, right? Now, here's what the Palaver tree definition of real engagement is. And that's how I want you to think about it from now on. It says that the real engagement is when a student's mind is genuinely grappling with an idea. When they are confused and they're pushing through it, when they are connecting something new to something they already know, or when they are constructing understanding rather than just receiving it. The signal to look for is not. I'm going to talk about what the signal is not, because that's, unfortunately, we've been trained to look for the signals that are the wrong signals, such as, are they busy? That is not a good signal to look for. Are they happy? Important, but not the ideal signal to look for. But are they thinking hard about something that matters? This right here is the signal you're looking for. And then we talk about the productive struggle principle. Learning requires what researchers call cognitive friction. That friction is important to have. It's got to be present at some moments during the lesson. A degree of challenge that demands genuine efforts from your students. Think of it as a dial. Turn it too low, students are bored, they're drifting, they're doing the work on autopilot. Basically, they're not even thinking. Turn it too high, students are overwhelmed, they're anxious, and they're shut down. That's not what you want. You don't want either of the two. We want what the just balance says. And the just balance sits in what Vygotsky called the zone of proximal development. Just beyond, it's a zone just beyond what students can do alone. Above that, just beyond that, but close enough that with the right support, they can get there. That zone, right there in the middle, is where real learning lives. And designing for it consistently is the craft of great teaching. Now that we talked about those, I want to go back to the reason why the trap is so hard to escape for most of us. I want to stop and be honest with you about something. Because if you've recognized your classroom in any of what I've described so far, I do not want you to walk away feeling like you've been doing it wrong this whole time. The engagement trap is hard to escape for very real reasons. And none of them are about effort, nor are they about caring. Because I'm aware, and I know for a fact, that most teachers that I've come across, most teachers that I've known, care deeply about their students and their students' learning. The problem is neither the teachers, nor is it the students. The problem is structural. And I'm going to go over the reasons why the trap is so hard to escape. And I said there were 4. So the first one, reason number 1, is the system rewards busyness, unfortunately. When instructional coaches or observers come to your classroom, the ones that evaluate you as teachers, they are almost universally designed to measure, they're trained to measure what they can see with their own eyes. And as you know, thinking is not visible, it's invisible, so they cannot see that. So how do we expect them to evaluate it if they were not trained to spot signals that show that students are thinking rather than just being busy? Because the quiet student staring intensely at a hard problem looks less engaged on a checklist than the group loudly decorating a poster. So if you put a student who is thinking hard about a problem that is very hard, and opposite to that, you put a group of students who are actively, boisterously decorating, cutting, and pasting posters, the observers are trained to see that group as the ones who are engaged and the student thinking hard about a problem as being not engaged. The system has built a feedback loop that incentivizes the wrong thing, and teachers respond rationally to the incentives they're given. Let's go to reason number 2. High demand lessons are harder to plan. Let's just face it. A lesson that genuinely challenges students to think requires more design time and more design work. You have to anticipate where they will get confused as a teacher. You have to craft questions that don't have obvious answers. You have to build scaffolds that support the struggle without removing the challenge. That is not easy. A worksheet, a video, a group poster, well, these things take 20 minutes to prepare and keep a class occupied for an hour. Teacher bandwidth is real. We all know they're burned out. We all know you're burned out as teachers. And this is not a moral failure on your part as a teacher. It is a structural problem that burns out the best teachers first. Let's go to reason number 3. This is where students have been trained to prefer busyness. High cognitive demand is uncomfortable because it requires effort. It requires tolerating confusion. It requires being willing to be wrong in front of other people. Students who have spent years in low-demand classrooms have been trained, although unintentionally, to expect easy work. So when a teacher suddenly raises the thinking bar, students push back naturally. They disengage, and they say it's boring, or it is too hard, or that it is not fair. That resistance feels like disengagement. But here's what it actually is. It is the friction of real learning beginning to happen. This is what Vygotsky called the friction. This is what he called actually the proximal zone where friction is happening. This is where it's happening. It's beginning to happen. So this is not the time to pull back as teachers. This is what he calls the zone of proximal development. And this is where the friction that we're looking for is happening. It's a cognitive friction happening. So this is not the time for you as a teacher to pull back because you're afraid that the student is going to give up or back off. This is the time to lean in. Let's go to reason number 4. We confuse enjoyment with learning. And this one is probably the most emotionally very difficult because we want our students to have love learning, and we should. I'm not saying we shouldn't. However, fun and learning are not synonymous. A Kahoot review game that everyone loves may produce almost no durable memory or learning. The lesson students talk about years later is rarely the one that was the easiest. It's the one where they genuinely struggled and figured something out. Joy and rigor are not opposites either. That's not what I'm saying. But the just balance holds both joy and rigor as important. When we sacrifice rigor in the name of keeping the mood alight, this is where the issue is. Because then we are making a trade that students did not agree to. Make sense? So, how do we design for real engagement? Is a question you might have. I want to give you 4 dimensions which is a framework you can use every day, every time you sit down to plan a lesson. So here they are, the 4 dimensions, starting with the first one. We talk about the cognitive demand, the thinking load. Every task you give to your students sits somewhere on a spectrum from low to high cognitive demand. You know, when you put low demand, here's what's happening. Students are going to be recalling information. They'll be identifying information, listing information, copying information, filling in the blanks. But when there is high demand, here's what's happening with the student. The students, they are analyzing, they are evaluating, the students are constructing meaning, they are justifying their reasoning, and they're applying to a new and unfamiliar context the information that they have learned. The just balance here is not that every moment has to be at a maximum demand. Not only is it exhausting and counterproductive, it is also unreasonable. However, what just balance is asking you is that high demand moments to exist in every lesson you design, purposefully and by design, not haphazardly. Use of Bloom's taxonomy as a planning lens, not as a compliance checkbox on your lesson plan template, but use of Bloom's taxonomy as a planning lens, and a genuine question you ask yourself is the following. Where in this lesson is the student being asked to do something they can't do on autopilot? So we're trying to eliminate the autopilot part of it. We want them to get into a thinking mode every time they're given a task, rather than just regurgitating information they have just seen and just copying on autopilot. Now, if you cannot answer this question, what that means is you need to go back to your design and do some revisions, because then you don't have those moments of high cognitive demands in that lesson. Dimension 2, relevance. This is the why it matters. So students engage cognitively when the material connects to a question that feels worth answering. Now, I'm going to be clear here. The worth answering is not to you as a teacher. It is worth answering to them as students. Of course, here relevancy is often misunderstood as making everything about students' personal lives. Although it is not a bad thing, it is too narrow. Because relevance is about building a bridge between the content and genuine human curiosity. The most powerful way to do that is to start every lesson with a question. Not with a topic, but with a question. And I'm not talking about questions like, today we are learning about the water cycle. What I'm talking about is questions like, why does it rain in some places and not in others? Questions like, why does it matter who decides where water goes? It is the same content, but they have completely different entry points, because one of them invites compliance, but the other one invites thinking, and that's what we want. That is exactly what we want, inviting thinking. That moves us to dimension number 3, which is productive struggle, the friction. I said earlier that learning requires cognitive friction. And here's what that means in practice. It means building tasks that students cannot complete on autopilot. I cannot stress that enough. This is the critical part. You can support the struggle without removing the struggle. The struggle needs to be there, and the students need to push through it with little help from you. Scaffolding is not giving student answers. Rather, it is giving them a foothold so they can keep climbing. There is a profound difference between those two things, because one of them removes learning, which is not what we want. The other one protects it, which is what we want. The I do, we do, you do model works beautifully here, but only if you do requires something the students don't already know how to do. If they've already mastered it, it is not learning, it is practice to them. And practice is valuable, but it is not the same as learning something new. Dimension 4, metacognition, thinking about thinking. And this is the deepest form of engagement, yet it is probably the most underused of all 4 dimensions. So what does metacognition mean? It means when students are aware of their own learning processes, when they can name what they understand, what they don't understand, or what they're doing to close the gap, that knowledge gap. This is in many ways the Palaver tree principle applied to individual learning. The Palaver tree was where a community gathered. But what was the gathering about? It was about reflecting together, deliberating together, and making meaning together. Metacognition is that gathering happening inside a student's mind. When you are designing your lesson, build in regular metacognitive prompts. And I'm not talking about questions like, what did you learn today? Or what, but questions that are like, what confused you today? What clicked today? What questions do you still have that you did not have when you walked into the classroom? And of course, I would like also for you to include exit tickets that ask for thinking. Not just answers, but for thinking. So what that means is not questions like, what is photosynthesis? Instead, why don't you say, what is still unclear to you about photosynthesis? And what would you do, or what would you need to understand it better? That question is worth more than any quiz score. So please build in those exit tickets. Now, I want to say that this purpose here is to actually retrain the eye you use when you circulate between your students' desks inspecting their work. Because most of us, unfortunately, have been trained to look for busyness. We ask questions such as, are they on task? Are they moving? Are they producing something? What I want you to look for is thinking, like clues for thinking, signs for thinking. Here are 4 diagnostic questions you could use in every time you circulate your classroom to get that. Starting with question number 1. It is, can they explain what they're doing and why? When you stop at a student's desk or the group's work, instead of asking questions such as, how is it going? Try asking this. Tell me what you're working on and why you are approaching it that way. Because now those questions kind of really force them to think through the process. Because now they have to justify the approach that they used. And they have to explain what they're working on. That means that involves the brain in a thinking process. If they can tell you what they're doing, but cannot tell you why, well, that means the task really isn't engaging their thinking. What they're doing is they're just basically executing steps, but not making decisions. Question number 2. Are they making decisions or just following steps? Recipe following is not thinking. If every student's product looks essentially identical, If there's only one way to complete this task, what that tells you is the thinking demand was probably low. Real cognitive engagement produces variation because thinking is individual. When students are genuinely deciding something, their decisions will differ. Question number 3. Is the confusion productive or is it paralyzing? See, confusion is good. When students are confused, that means their thinking is engaged. However, we're talking about two different confusions here. Okay? Because when somebody's confused, it means the brain is encountering something it does not yet know how to categorize. And that's the beginning of learning. What we want is what we call the productive confusion. What does that mean? How do you recognize it? This is when heads are together, thinking, debating, trying things, making attempts, as opposed to paralyzing confusion, in which case you see heads down, silence, and students waiting for rescue, or students just giving up. Your job in the second case is not to remove the hurdles. It is not to remove the confusion. As I said, the confusion is necessary. What your job is to give a foothold, maybe give a hint, maybe even reframe the problem enough to give the student something to move ahead with without removing the struggle. Question number 4. What would they remember tomorrow? Are they going to retain the information they're learning today, tomorrow? This is the mental simulation test. After a lesson, close your eyes and ask yourself this question. 24 hours from now, what is still going to be left in their heads? If the honest answer is probably not much, then the task was busy but not meaningful, not involving thinking. And that right there is your signal to go back to your design and do a redesign. I've included an engagement audit checklist in the description of this video where all 4 of these questions are put on one page. It is formatted for real-time use as you circulate your class. Print it, use it for a week. It will change what you see in the classroom. And please come back and share with me what you think about the engagement audit checklist. Now let me make this more concrete with 3 scenarios you probably lived through. Starting with scenario number 1, the group project that goes nowhere. Now you've had a group project where the students have worked for 3 days, cutting, decorating, dividing up work, creating beautiful posters, and almost no evidence of understanding. There's none. You have no evidence that they understand what they were doing. The trap here is that the project was the product, not the thinking. So in a just balance framework, please go ahead and anchor the project in a question that requires genuine reasoning by asking this kind of question. What would our city do about X? What should our city do about X? And how would you defend your reasoning to someone who disagrees? And I also would like for you to build in structured checkpoints. Now, I'm not talking about progress checkpoints. I'm talking about reasoning checks with questions such as, tell me your argument. Tell me the strongest counter argument of somebody who may disagree with you. And how would you respond to that counter argument? It is the same problem. I mean the same project, not a problem, but same project, but completely different cognitive experience. Moving on to scenario number 2. This is the video lesson where you show your class a 20-minute long video. You observe your students as being attentive to the video. The next day you decide to quiz them on the video, and you realize that the student didn't retain much from the video. The trap here is it was a passive watching, not involving any thinking, because the brain needs to do something with the information to hold on to it. So the brain needs to do something with the information to be able to hold on to it. During the passive watching, that was not required. In a just balanced framework, please go ahead and frame the video with a question before you even press the play button. Also, please pause it halfway through so that you may have a 2-minute processing task with questions such as, or tasks such as, write down the most surprising thing so far, and one question you now have, having watched half of the video. And then end the video with student-generated questions instead of teacher-generated answers. It is the same video, but completely different cognitive engagement. The information passes through a thinking brain instead of a simply watching and passive one. Scenario number 3. This is the discussion that's really a monologue, where you ask a question to your class. 3 students raise their hands, and then they provide their answers. The 27 other students in your class, they're not learning, they're just passive bystanders. They're present, they're in the classroom, they're compliant, but they're not part of the learning. The trap here is whole classroom discussions without structure tend to default to the most confident voices dominating the class, at the detriment of those who are not confident. In a just balance framework, use a think, pair, share activity before whole class discussions. In questioning that pushes them deeper into thinking rather than just moving on. For instance, questions like, what makes you say that? What would someone who disagrees with you say about what you just said? Can you build on what she just said? These are questions that encourage students to delve deeper into thinking. So these 3 scenarios, the goal is not participation. The goal here is more thinking. Because guess what? When you design for thinking, you don't have to worry about participation because it will come naturally. Again, having said all this, I would like to be clear that I'm not saying that busyness is a sin. Students need to produce things. They need to collaborate. They need to move, create, and do. So I'm not asking you to turn your classroom into a boot camp. Far from that. What I'm asking you to do is, before you finalize your lesson plans, ask yourself one question. Where is it in this lesson that a student is required to think about something they don't already know how to think about? If you can answer that question, you have a learning lesson. But if you cannot, you have a busy lesson. And busy lessons, while there are not nothing, they are not enough. Real engagement is uncomfortable because it has friction in it, and that friction is necessary. It has confusion in it, and it is is a necessity. It has a student staring at a problem they don't immediately know how to solve, yet deciding to push through it. That moment right there is learning. That is what we're designing toward. That's our goal. That is what the Just Balance makes possible. It is what your students deserve from you as well. Once again, the audit checklist is in the description. 1 page, 4 questions, ready to use tomorrow. Download it, use it. If this video shifted something for you, please share it with a colleague. The conversation that changes how we plan lessons is the conversation that changes what students actually learn. In the next video, I'll be talking about differentiation without burnout. And I say this because there is an unreasonable expectation from the teachers to design multiple lesson plans to be able to reach every learner's needs. That's not reasonable, and it's overwhelming and exhausting. I'm going to share what the approach 80-20 approach is that every teacher needs, because it is a smarter way of meeting every learner's needs without the need to plan for 30 lesson plans. And I will share that with you in the next video. Until then, I am Henry. This is Palaver Tree, the Just Balance in every classroom for every teacher. I look forward to seeing you in the next video talking about differentiation without burnout. Until then, stay safe and thank you.